The day the rations failed began with a sound that was wrong. It was a thin, strained chime instead of the usual smooth tone of the nutrient dispensers, like a machine trying to clear its throat and choking on the attempt. The alien cadets stood in a loose line in front of the supply crate, eyes a dozen colors wide with expectation, already tasting the bland but reliable protein gel in their minds. The crate's surface glowed for a moment, flickered, then dimmed to a dull, sickly orange. A warning glyph pulsed once. No fresh nutrient packs slid from the dispensing slot. No steaming containers of synthesized stew appeared on the retractable tray. There was only silence and that slow, pulsing light that meant malfunction. For a long breath, no one moved. The wind moved first, sliding across the scrubland and rustling the violet grasses that grew in stubborn clumps between pale rocks. A nearby tree, all twisted gray limbs and oval leaves, clicked softly in the breeze. Mark, the only human in the group, watched the crate's lights stutter again and felt a cold, practical weight settle in his stomach. He had seen machines fail before. Ration packs that spoiled, filters that clogged, batteries that died halfway through a long hike. Technology broke. Biology did not care about excuses. Hunger did not read error codes. At first, the cadets did not understand what had happened. An insectoid cadet with a narrow thorax and translucent wing casings stepped closer to the crate. His name was Kirik, and his antennae were already twitching with unease. He tapped the control panel with one delicate claw, then harder, as if force could correct whatever had gone wrong. The crate responded with the same weak chime and the same pulsing orange glyph. "Try again," Kirik said, his voice sharp with a buzz at the edges. Another cadet, tall and serpentine with scaled skin that shifted colors with his mood, slithered closer and brushed him aside. Saran ran his hands over the crate, pressed every visible control, muttered something in his own language, then struck the side of the machine with the heel of his hand. A few stray crumbs of dried nutrient gel drifted out of the tray, remnants from the last successful cycle. That was all. On the edge of the clearing, the instructor watched. She was older than the cadets, her crest of bony ridges dulled with age, her eyes steady and unreadable. Her name was Instructor Vale, and she had brought the group to this semi-arid training world to teach them survival away from starships, cities, and automated support systems. She had not told them that the rations might fail. She had not told them that the supply crate had been deliberately sabotaged to test what would happen when comfort vanished. Mark glanced at her, searching her face for some sign of concern, some hint that she would intervene. She did not move. She did not speak. Her arms were folded across her chest, and her gaze rested on the crate like a judge waiting for the verdict to emerge on its own. The cadets turned away from the crate one by one, like a single organism slowly realizing that something vital had stopped working. A short cadet with soft furred skin and wide amber eyes lifted a nutrient pack from the storage bin, shook it, and frowned when a hollow slosh answered instead of the usual viscous heaviness. She tore it open. A thin, watery smear slid into the pouch, pale and useless. She tasted it and spat immediately, fur bristling along her neck. "It is empty," she said, horrified. "It has nothing. It tastes like cleaning fluid." A murmur moved through the group. Mark watched one cadet open another pack, then another. Some fell apart in gelatinous clumps that smelled faintly of metal and sour algae. Some contained only air and the faintest trace of powder. The few that still held something vaguely edible were obviously past safe use, their surfaces bulging, their seals warped. One pack burst in the hands of a cadet, splattering his chest with a gray paste that fizzed and smoked in the air. He flung it away with a cry, and it hissed in the dirt until it dried into flakes. "This is impossible," Saran said, his scales shifting toward a blotchy, distressed yellow. "The auto-supply system restocks every cycle. It cannot fail like this." "It has failed," Kirik answered, voice thin. "You can smell the spoilage. The regulators did not maintain temperature, or something poisoned the tanks, or "Or we are in a survival course," Mark said quietly. He kept his voice even and calm, the way he had learned to speak when he needed a group to listen instead of panic. And this is the part where the safety net disappears. Several cadets turned to glare at him. One with pale, translucent skin and visible blue veins took a step closer, his expression tense. "That crate is rated for 10 rotations," the cadet insisted. "We tested the seals before departure. It cannot simply break." "Machines do not ask permission," Mark replied. "Sometimes they just stop working, or someone wants to see what happens when they stop." He let his gaze drift deliberately toward Instructor Vale. For the briefest moment, he saw something flicker in her eyes, something like approval. Then her face was blank again. The cadets followed his glance. Someone whispered that perhaps Vale had a hidden backup, an emergency cache tucked away behind a ridge or underground. Someone else suggested hiking back to the drop point and demanding extraction. A third cadet argued that the training agreement forbade unscheduled retrieval and that leaving the designated area would count as failure. Each voice raised the tension a little higher, like steam building in a sealed pipe. No one mentioned hunger yet, but it hovered in the air, an invisible predator moving closer with every passing minute. The sun hung high in the pale sky, harsh and unforgiving. This world's star cast a white light that bleached colors and threw sharp shadows. The landscape around the camp was open and exposed. Low shrubs with spiny leaves, scattered stands of wind-twisted trees, and long stretches of cracked earth where hardy grasses clung to life in narrow crevices. In the distance, ridges of rock rose in layered bands, hiding valleys and ravines that the group had not yet explored. Mark's eyes moved across all of it, cataloging possibilities the way his grandparents had taught him when he was small and the power grid failed during storms. Shelter, water, food, hazards, always in that order. The camp had shelter, simple lean-tos made from local branches and woven fabric, arranged in a semicircle around the dying supply crate. The camp had water, a filtration unit attached to a small cistern that drew from an underground seep. That unit still hummed steadily, its status lights calm and green. The camp did not have food anymore, not from machines at least. Instructor Vale finally stepped forward. Her movements were measured, each step deliberate, as if she walked through a classroom instead of dust and scattered stones. The cadets fell silent at once, all conversations snapping closed like shutters in a storm. She stopped beside the crate and placed one hand on its dented surface. "Your automated ration support has failed," she said. Her voice was not unkind, but it had a hard edge that cut through any hope of easy comfort. "Your supplies are compromised beyond safe use. Consumption is prohibited except under controlled medical observation, which I will not provide in this context. This was always a possibility. You were warned that technology could not be your only tool." Kirik's antennae flattened against his skull. "Instructor, without rations we cannot maintain proper energy levels for the scheduled exercises. The training plan—" "The plan," Vale interrupted, "has changed. Adaptation is part of survival. Your bodies require fuel. The world around you contains fuel. Your task is to obtain it and process it without poisoning yourselves. The trial continues." A low ripple of protest moved through the cadets. Mark saw fear in their eyes, a very specific kind of fear he recognized from disaster preparedness drills back on Earth. It was the horror of someone raised in a world of endless infrastructure suddenly imagining an empty shelf, a dark screen, a silent machine. Most of these cadets came from planets where synthesizers produced meals on demand, where agricultural zones were automated to the point that no one actually touched soil except as a novelty. For them, food was a button press and a wait, not a living thing that had to be found, taken apart, and made safe. Mark, on the other hand, had grown up in a town where the power grid failed every few winters, and the community kept a manual well pump just in case. His grandfather had taught him how to set simple snares in the woods and how to clean fish without wasting anything vital. At the time, he had thought of it as an old man's stubborn refusal to trust technology. Now, as the last usable nutrient packs were tossed onto a growing discard pile, he felt an unexpected surge of gratitude. Instructor Vale looked over the group, her gaze lingering on each cadet in turn. You have 4 standard days remaining in this exercise. The environmental scans confirmed the presence of multiple edible species in this region. Small ground herbivores, a few manageable predators, various insects, and several fruiting plants. Your task is to secure sufficient nutrition for the entire group, following standard safety protocols. Collaboration is expected. She paused. No one leaves the exercise area without authorization. No one contacts orbit unless injury or illness reaches critical levels. Questions? The cadets looked at one another, hesitant. Saran finally spoke. Instructor, you expect us to hunt? His voice held genuine disbelief, as if the word itself tasted wrong in his mouth. With what? Vale's gaze drifted over to the stacked training gear. Dull practice blades, non-lethal stun batons, signal flares, and a handful of sensor beacons. With whatever you can build, adapt, or improvise, she answered. You have tools, you have hands, you have minds, use them. I will observe and intervene only to prevent catastrophic error or death. This is a survival course, not an execution. She stepped back, signaling that she had finished speaking. The formal structure of her words made it clear. The problem now belonged to the cadets. A heavy silence settled over the camp. The cadets were smart. They could calculate orbital trajectories in their heads, disassemble field transmitters, and discuss the ethics of first contact with academic precision. But as Mark watched them stare at the empty ration crate, he realized that none of that mattered if no one knew how to put actual food in a mouth without a machine in between. His stomach grumbled, a low reminder of the half-portion breakfast he had eaten hours ago. The horizon shimmered with heat. The cadets' voices rose again, but this time in fragments, scattered and uncertain. Someone suggested rationing the few questionable packs that still looked almost safe, stretching them out with roots and berries that the database had listed as probably non-lethal. Someone else pointed out that probably non-lethal was not a reassuring classification. Kirik proposed that the group organize into teams to search for edible plants according to the field guide stored in the training tablets. The tablets, of course, drew power from the same solar array that ran the water unit, and a nervous cadet immediately worried aloud about what would happen if that system failed as well. Mark listened for a while, tracking the shape of the conversation. No one spoke about hunting except as something distasteful or distant. No one mentioned building anything more complex than a digging stick. His mind began to assemble a plan almost without permission, layering one remembered instruction over another. Track, bait, funnel, trap, kill quickly, clean thoroughly, cook or preserve. He looked out toward the scrubland again and saw not just rocks and grass but paths, choke points, possible burrows. He watched a small, quick creature dart from one patch of shade to another, leaving a faint trail in the dust. He saw where the rocks narrowed, where a snare would be easy to set and hard to avoid. Hunger sharpened every detail. Instructor Vale's gaze met his, just for an instant. Something passed between them, something unspoken and pragmatic. She knew, he realized. She knew that he had experience none of the others shared. She would not announce it. That would defeat the purpose of the exercise. She would let the group flounder until someone stepped up. Mark felt the weight of that knowledge settle on his shoulders like a pack he had not agreed to carry, but could not put down. He took a slow breath, tasting dust and the faint metallic tang of spoiled nutrient gel in the air. The cadets' voices had begun to rise again, edging toward panic. Fear would waste energy faster than hunger. And if no one moved soon, the first real wave of weakness would hit after sunset and make every decision harder. He stepped forward, away from the lean-to he had helped build on the first day, and raised his voice just enough to cut through the noise. "We need to stop arguing about what the crate should have done," he said. "It is dead. We are not. If we want to keep it that way, we have to find food that walks, crawls, or grows. Standing here will not feed anyone." A few heads turned. Saran's scales flickered from yellow to a confused green. Kirik's antennae twitched, orienting toward Mark. Instructor Vale did not move, but her eyes followed him with close attention. Mark felt the dry ground under his boots, and the dry air in his lungs, and the very real emptiness beginning to open beneath his ribs. "The rations are gone," he said softly, more to himself than to the others. "All right, then we do this the old way." Mark did not expect silence, but the silence that followed his words felt heavier than the dry air settling over the clearing. The cadets stared at him as if he had suggested they swallow rocks or breathe fire. None of them stepped forward immediately, yet none of them dismissed him either. Hunger was already speaking louder than pride. Instructor Vale remained still at the edge of the clearing, her arms folded, her posture relaxed in the way a predator relaxes when it knows the hunt will come to it sooner or later. Mark could almost feel her watching the next move, waiting for someone to take the role she would not assign by force. A few cadets exchanged hopeful glances, silently asking who would volunteer to lead, who would step into the space Mark had opened. But no one moved. If fear had a sound, it would have been the faint rustling of the grasses and the scraping of claws and boots over dusty soil. Mark looked at the sun again, gauging its angle. He estimated there were 6 hours until dusk, 6 hours to accomplish more than discussion. He exhaled slowly, acknowledging the quiet that pressed around him. He had hoped one of the cadets would speak before he had to say anything further. The moment stretched. He finally stepped forward, not dramatically, not loudly, just far enough that the group had no excuse to pretend they had not seen him take initiative. "I am going to scout the terrain," he said. "Anyone who wants to help can come with me." Kirik clicked his mandibles nervously, but he stepped forward first. His wings trembled with agitation, but he did not step back. "I will assist," he said, though his voice lacked confidence. Saran hesitated, glancing between Mark and the water unit, as if half expecting the machine to miraculously begin producing protein gel again. Nothing changed. A long moment passed before he finally slithered forward as well, his long tail shifting across the ground in a ripple. 2 others joined, a furred cadet with amber eyes named Tali and a pale, translucent-skinned cadet named Varen. The rest remained behind, none daring to join, but none daring to discourage either. Instructor Vale did not speak. She simply watched as Mark gestured to his small team. The first task was simple: understand the land. The group left the clearing, stepping into the uneven scrubland where violet grasses brushed their legs and stones cracked underfoot. The wind carried the dry scent of dust and something faintly sweet, a flowering shrub Mark had noticed earlier. He crouched, letting his fingers brush the ground. The soil was soft in some places, compacted in others. The planet's ecosystem was harsh, but it was alive. Mark rose and began walking in a slow arc, guiding the small group toward an area where he had earlier noticed tracks. He heard Kirik buzzing anxiously behind him. "What exactly are we looking for?" Kirik asked. "Signs of life," Mark answered. "Movement, tracks, droppings, burrows. Anything that tells us what creatures live nearby and how they move." The cadets exchanged puzzled looks. Saran lifted his head, eyes narrowing as he scanned the ground. "You expect us to read dirt?" he said, his tone more wary than mocking. "Dirt remembers what steps on it," Mark replied simply. After a few more meters, he stopped and knelt. A small impression in the dusty soil caught his eye. He gestured for the others to gather. The mark was faint, but clear to someone who knew how to look. 3 small toe prints and a deeper rear indentation from a creature about the size of his hand. "Something passed through here recently," Mark said. Tali crouched beside him, her fur puffing with nervous energy. "How can you tell? It looks like nothing." Mark reached out and touched the edge of the print lightly. "The outline is sharp, No wind erosion yet. And there is a second print right there, he pointed. And a third. It moved this direction. The cadets leaned closer, studying the ground with intense concentration. Varen tilted his head. How do you know it is edible? He asked. I do not, Mark answered honestly. I know it is alive. That is the first step. He rose and motioned for the group to continue. As they walked, Mark explained how animals tended to move, the need for shade, the instinct to follow the edges of terrain, the paths that led to water. The cadets listened quietly, their usual academic superiority replaced with unfamiliar humility. For the first time, Mark felt them truly absorbing his words. They reached a narrow choke point between two boulders, where a thin trail of dust led toward a cluster of hardy shrubs. The ground here showed more prints, deeper ones from a larger creature, likely weighing around 20 kilograms, judging from the stride. Mark felt a small spark of satisfaction. This is good, he said. The area forces creatures through this narrow gap. It is perfect for a trap. Saran raised his crest, startled. A trap? What kind? A simple snare first, Mark said. If we build it correctly, it will catch something by morning. Tali shifted uneasily. How do we build it? We do not have proper materials. Mark scanned the surroundings. Yes, we do. Branches from those shrubs will work. Vines from that tree can be twisted into rope. We use stones for the trigger weight. The cadets stared at him as if he had performed a magic trick. Mark knelt beside the shrubs and began examining their branches. He chose a few flexible ones, testing their resilience by bending them in slow arcs. Satisfied, he began shaping them into a frame. The cadets watched in rapt silence as his hands moved with practiced precision. He stripped vines from the tree, splitting them into thinner cords and twisting them tightly into a durable line. Then he explained the mechanics: tension, trigger sensitivity, pressure thresholds, escape angles. Saran leaned in. You know how to do all of this, he said slowly, as if you have done it many times. My grandfather taught me, Mark answered. He said knowing how to catch your dinner meant you would never starve. He pulled the loop tight and attached it to the trigger. He was not wrong. Tali sniffed one of the vines. It smells unpleasant. That is good, Mark said. Many creatures avoid strong scents, but some ground creatures do not. They rely more on motion and shadow. Kirik watched Mark set the trigger stone. His antennae twitched as he tried to understand the mechanism. Will it hurt the creature? He asked. It will restrain it, Mark replied. That is the point. The snare took shape more quickly than the cadets expected. When Mark finally stepped back, the trap was nearly invisible to an untrained eye. Saran stared at it in awe. It looks like nothing, he said. Just sticks and vines. That is how a trap should look, Mark replied. Convince the creature it is safe. Let it walk into danger on its own. With the snare complete, Mark led them further along the terrain. He pointed out signs of burrows near a line of cracked earth and potential locations for deadfall traps. The cadets helped gather stones and branches, mimicking the techniques Mark demonstrated. Their movements were clumsy at first, but by the second hour they began to coordinate more smoothly. Kirik's delicate claws turned out to be surprisingly precise for tying knots. Tali's strength made her ideal for lifting heavier stones. Saran's flexible body allowed him to maneuver through tight spaces to anchor supports. Even Varen contributed by identifying which vines had the strongest internal fibers. Mark felt a small swell of pride, not for himself, but for them. They were learning. They were working. They were moving beyond fear. Then he spotted something important. A low, narrow path branching toward a shaded hollow. The ground there showed scattered seeds, cracked shells, and the faint scent of animal musk. This is a feeding area, Mark said. Small creatures come here often. Tali flicked one ear. Then we set another trap? Yes, a funnel trap this time. He showed them how to construct guiding walls from branches and stones, narrowing into a small drop pit. He demonstrated how the pit should be disguised with loose soil and camouflage. The cadets followed his instructions, sweating under the hot sun but pushing through exhaustion. By the time the sun began drifting low, the group had set 3 effective traps. The cadets stood beside Mark, their faces streaked with dust, but their eyes alive with something new: purpose. "We have done enough for today," Mark said. "We head back." As they walked toward the camp, Saren looked at him with a mixture of curiosity and admiration. "We would not have known to do any of this," he admitted. "We would have searched for fruit until nightfall, then collapsed from weakness. You saw what to do immediately." Mark shrugged. "Experience matters, and you all worked hard. We will check the traps in the morning." The cadets exchanged looks, hopeful, uncertain, but no longer helpless. When they returned to camp, Instructor Vale's gaze swept over them slowly. Her expression did not change, but something in her eyes softened. Mark could almost hear her unspoken acknowledgement. "Good." "You stepped forward." Mark simply nodded to her and went to drink from the water unit, exhaustion finally washing over him. He felt sweat drying on his skin, felt dust clinging to his clothes, felt the ache in his muscles, and felt strangely satisfied. The cadets had followed him into the scrubland uncertain and afraid. They returned with a plan, with skills, and with the first threads of responsibility woven into their actions. Tomorrow, they would see whether the world agreed to feed them. Mark woke before the others, pulled from sleep by the faint gray light that seeped over the ridge and the quiet, rhythmic chirping of the small creatures hidden in the shrubs. For a moment he lay still, listening to the camp breathe. The cadets slept uneasily, murmuring in their native languages, their bodies curled in tight shapes that betrayed how unused they were to hunger and hard ground. His muscles ached pleasantly, the kind of ache earned through effort rather than injury. He stretched once, stood, and stepped away from the lean-to. The air held the coolness of early morning, still untouched by the sharp heat that would rise with the sun. He let it fill his lungs as he scanned the clearing. Instructor Vale stood near the water unit, motionless as a stone pillar, watching the horizon. She did not acknowledge him, but she did not need to. He felt her presence like a quiet expectation lingering in the air. She wanted to see what he would do next, but she would never tell him what that should be. Mark gathered his pack, checked the small knife at his belt, and moved toward the cluster of lean-tos where the cadets slept. He shook Saren's shoulder first. The serpentine cadet jerked awake instantly, his scales flashing a startled deep red before settling into a calmer green. "Morning already?" Saran muttered. "We need to check the traps," Mark said, "before the heat rises." Saran hesitated only a moment before nodding. Tali woke next, blinking her amber eyes sleepily and stretching her limbs with soft groans. Kirik needed little prompting. His antennae perked with anxious readiness the moment Mark touched his shoulder. Varen rose silently, still pale in the early light, but steady. They shared no breakfast. There was none to share. The emptiness in their stomachs made their movements sharper, their eyes more focused. Hunger had become a teacher faster than any instructor could have hoped for. The group left camp as the first sliver of sunlight crested the rocks. The violet grasses whispered as they brushed past, releasing dew like tiny pearls that clung to their boots. The terrain seemed different in the morning light, more alive, more unpredictable. Every shadow hinted at movement. Mark led them toward the first snare. He moved quietly, signaling for the others to do the same. Loud footsteps could startle any trapped creature into fighting, and that was never good for the trap or the one retrieving it. When they approached the narrow choke point between the boulders, he slowed and held up a hand for silence. The cadets halted behind him, tense and breathless. The snare was hidden just ahead, camouflaged by dust and twigs. Mark crouched and scanned the ground. Then he saw it. The vine rope was taut, pulled to its full length. Something had triggered the loop and been lifted partly into the air. A faint rustling came from behind a bush. Mark approached carefully, signaling for the cadets to stay back until he confirmed what had been caught. A small creature struggled in the snare, furred, agile, with a narrow snout and long hind legs built for quick darting bursts of speed. It was suspended just enough that its paws scraped uselessly at the air. Its dark eyes rolled in frantic fear as Mark approached. Tali gasped. "It worked," she whispered, shock and wonder mixing in her voice. Saran stared with wide, shifting eyes. This is real prey." Mark nodded. "It is alive and healthy. That means we can use it." He approached slowly, knife ready. The creature twisted and squealed when he touched the vine, but he held its body still with practiced firmness. The cadets watched in thick silence as he ended the creature's fear quickly and cleanly. For a long moment after it went limp, none of them spoke. The reality of what they were doing settled over them like a new weight. Not fear this time, but responsibility. Mark lowered the creature and untied it from the loop. "This is enough meat for a few of us," he said, "but we need more." Kirik's antennae drooped. "Will we have enough for everyone?" "We will know after we check the other traps," Mark said. "One step at a time." They wrapped the small animal in Tali's spare cloth and moved toward the funnel trap. The sun climbed higher, painting the rocks gold. Sweat gathered on Mark's forehead, but he kept up a steady pace. Behind him, the cadets walked with renewed alertness, scanning the ground for more signs of movement or danger. When they reached the funnel trap, Saran froze. "Look!" he hissed, pointing ahead. The camouflage Mark had placed over the drop pit had caved inward slightly, as though something had stepped onto it and fallen through. A faint, muffled scrabbling echoed from inside the pit. Tali hurried forward despite Mark's raised hand, almost tripping in her eagerness. Inside the pit, a larger creature flailed weakly, its limbs short but strong, its hide thick and mottled. It had tried to climb out, leaving deep claw marks on the dirt walls, but the sides were too smooth for its weight. It let out a low, guttural grunt when it saw the group approach. "That one could feed half the camp," Saran whispered. "Maybe more," Mark agreed. "We have to finish it safely." Tali's ears flattened nervously. "How? It looks strong." "It is, but it is tired, and we can use the narrow angle of the pit." He instructed Saran to hold a long branch across the opening to keep the creature's attention. Meanwhile, Mark positioned himself at the other edge, timed the creature's movements carefully, and delivered a precise, controlled strike with the knife. The creature slumped, its weight settling slowly. For a heartbeat, silence reigned again. Then Kirik's wings buzzed with excitement. "We did it!" he said, unable to contain himself. Mark pulled him back slightly. "Not yet. We have to pull it out. Help me with the branches." The five of them worked together, using vines as improvised ropes to haul the creature onto the surface. It was heavy, nearly as heavy as Tali, but they managed, grunting and stumbling together until the body lay on the ground beside the pit. Mark saw pride in their exhausted faces. He felt pride, too. The third trap, a simple deadfall, held nothing, just a scattered layer of disturbed soil and a few cracked seeds. Mark inspected it, adjusted the trigger mechanism, and nodded. "Something inspected it," he said. "We might catch something tonight." But even without a third catch, they had enough food to work with. More than enough. The walk back to camp was very different from the walk that morning. The cadets carried the smaller creature carefully, Tali holding it close while Saran assisted. Mark dragged the heavier one over his shoulder, muscles burning, but he refused to ask for help. He wanted the cadets to see that he could bear the most difficult task, and that if he could do it, so could they. When they reached the clearing, the other cadets sprang to their feet instantly. Their eyes latched onto the carcasses with shock, revulsion, hunger, and relief all tangled together. Some stepped back, uneasy. Others stepped closer, drawn by curiosity. Instructor Vale approached slowly. Her eyes flicked from the creatures to Mark, then to the cadets beside him. "You succeeded," she said, "more quickly than expected." Saran puffed his crest in pride. Mark guided us. We learned. Vale looked at Mark. Something like approval glinted in her steady gaze. Good. Then the next step is processing the meat. A ripple of discomfort passed through some cadets. The idea of preparing food without machines unsettled them more than the idea of catching it. Mark understood. He stepped forward and laid the larger carcass on a flat stone. "I will show you," he said. "All of you." The cadets gathered in a half-circle. Some covered their noses. Others stared with wide eyes, fascinated despite themselves. Mark began the butchering process with steady hands, explaining each cut, each separation of hide from muscle, each organ to avoid. He demonstrated how to use every part efficiently: meat for eating, sinew for binding, bones for tools, hide for wraps. The cadets flinched at first, but gradually stepped closer, asking questions, offering help. Even those who had not joined the trap team leaned in, drawn by the raw practicality of the skills unfolding before them. Mark guided them gently, correcting their mistakes calmly, showing them how to handle knives safely, how to identify edible sections, how to avoid contamination. By the time the sun reached its peak, the cadets were working beside him, their hands stained, their expressions transformed. Hunger had given way to determination. Disgust had faded into understanding. Mark washed his hands in the purified water, then looked over the spread of cleaned meat, neatly separated. "We have enough for today," he said, "and enough to preserve for tomorrow." The cadets exchanged glances filled with tired pride. For the first time, the fear that had clung to them since the rations failed was gone. In its place stood capability. And capability, Mark knew, was worth more than any machine they had left behind. Mark looked over the piles of fresh meat the cadets had helped him prepare. The sun had climbed high, bleaching the world into pale gold and deep shadow, and the air had grown hot enough to dry sweat the moment it formed. The camp buzzed with a nervous energy. The cadets kept glancing at the spread of meat with a mixture of relief and uncertainty. They had food for the moment, but only for the moment. If they simply cooked everything now, it would spoil within hours under this harsh sun. They needed a solution that would last longer than one meal. Mark wiped his hands on a strip of cloth and stood. "We need to build a drying rack," he said. "It will keep the meat edible for days." Confusion rippled through the cadets. Drying meat was an alien concept to most of them. Kirik tilted his head, antennae stiff. "You mean, leave it out?" he asked, baffled. Mark shook his head. "Not just leave it out. Dry it properly. Heat, airflow, and smoke. That combination preserves the meat." Instructor Vale approached, stopping a respectful distance away. She did not speak, but she watched closely, waiting to see how Mark intended to transform raw meat into something the cadets could rely on for the rest of the trial. 4 cadets, Saran, Kirik, Tali, and Varen, came forward at once, still riding the momentum of the morning's success. Mark nodded. "Good. I will need all of you." He began by scanning the area around the camp, looking for the right kind of branches. The trees nearby grew twisted and low, their gray limbs tough and flexible. Mark walked toward one of the largest clusters and placed his hand on a thick branch. "This wood is good for a rack," he said. "Strong enough to hold weight, flexible enough to bind together." Tali flexed her fingers and stepped forward. "I can break these," she offered. Her species was smaller than most, but her stocky build gave her surprising strength. Mark nodded appreciatively. "Do it," he said. "We need at least 6 long branches and 4 shorter ones." Tali placed her hands around a branch and snapped it cleanly with a sharp crack. Kirik flinched, startled by the sound. Saran helped gather the fallen pieces while Varen knelt beside the tree, searching for usable fallen limbs that would not require breaking. Mark moved from tree to tree, collecting vines, the same kind he had used for the snares. He tested each vine's strength by pulling it until it creaked. Some were too brittle, others were perfect. He gathered a long coil over his shoulder and returned to the group. They carried their materials back to the clearing. Mark laid everything out neatly on the ground and began constructing the frame. He explained each step, making sure the cadets understood the purpose of every joint and knot. "The meat has to be kept off the ground," he said. "Insects will find it if we leave it too low, but too high, and the smoke will not reach it properly." Kirik crouched beside him, his wings rustling anxiously. "How high is correct?" he asked. Mark held his hand above his knee. "About this high. Enough space for smoke to pass through, but not enough for heat to scorch it." Saran frowned, studying the structure as it took shape. "Why smoke?" he asked. "Why not simply dry it in the sun?" "Sun alone dries the outside," Mark said. "But inside, the meat stays wet. Wet meat rots quickly. Smoke dries it more evenly and adds a protective layer." Tali sniffed. "It will smell strange." "Maybe," Mark answered. "But it will be safe, and it will feed everyone." The cadets worked beside him as he lashed the branches into a sturdy rectangular structure with crossed supports. His hands moved quickly, automatically, each motion the result of old memories. Weekends in the woods with his grandfather, practicing skills that had felt outdated at the time. Now those memories guided his fingers as surely as any training manual. Saran helped anchor the frame into the ground by pressing stones against its corners, and Varen used his delicate, translucent fingers to weave extra vine strands through the joints, tightening them until the wood stopped wobbling. Kirik hovered nervously nearby, laser-focused on each step, as if memorizing every detail for future use. With the rack complete, Mark stepped back to inspect it. It stood the height of his waist, sturdy and well-balanced. "Good work," he said. The cadets exchanged proud, tired smiles. Next came the fire. Mark led them to gather dry moss and fallen bark from the trees. The moss crumbled easily between his fingers. Perfect tinder. He arranged a small pile under the rack, layering it with thin twigs and thicker branches. He showed Kirik how to place each piece, building a small, controlled fire rather than a large blaze. "We do not want flames touching the meat," Mark warned. "We want smoke. Slow, steady smoke." Kirik nodded quickly, antennae bobbing. "Smoke, not fire," he repeated as if committing the words to memory. Mark struck his metal striker against a piece of flint, sending sparks into the tinder. The moss caught almost immediately, releasing a thin trail of white smoke. He fed the fire carefully, coaxing it to life without letting it grow too hot. When the fire settled into a steady smolder, Mark called for the others. "Bring the strips." The cadets collected the long, thin slices of meat Mark had prepared earlier. Each piece was smooth, evenly cut, and washed. Tali wrinkled her nose but carried her portion dutifully. Saran held his with an oddly reverent expression, as though transporting something sacred. Mark began hanging the strips over the rack. He draped them with space between each one so air could circulate. The cadets followed his example, watching the smoke curl gently around the meat, carrying the scent of burning bark and heated moss. The smell grew richer as the fire settled into its rhythm, earthy, sharp, and strangely comforting. The cadets breathed it in deeply, their hunger intensifying. "When will it be ready?" Varen asked softly. "Hours for the outer layer," Mark said. "A full day for good preservation. We can eat a little today, but most of it will be dried for later." Kirik traced the air with one claw. "So this is how you make food last?" "Yes," Mark said. "Without machines, without pack regeneration, just wood, smoke, and time." The cadets exchanged glances. Something shifted among them, something heavier than fear, lighter than pride. Understanding, respect, perhaps even a little awe. Mark checked the tension on the vines holding the rack. Everything was steady. Satisfied, he stood and surveyed the scene. The smoke drifted upward in pale spirals, carrying with it a sense of safety the camp had lacked since the rations failed. For the first time since the trial began, the cadets looked less like frightened students and more like a group learning to survive through their own hands. Instructor Vale approached and stood beside Mark, watching the smoke rise. Efficient construction, she said. You have provided your group with more than just food. You have given them competence. Mark did not answer immediately. He watched Saren adjusting a strip of meat, watched Kirik brushing ash away from the fire pit, watched Tali looking at the rack with fierce determination. Varen carefully tested the air currents around the rack with his hand, fascinated by the way smoke moved. They are learning, Mark said quietly. That is what matters. Vael nodded once. And that is why this test exists. With that, she stepped back, returning to her silent observation. Mark crouched to adjust the wood beneath the rack. When he stood again, he saw the cadets still working, talking, experimenting, and building something essential, not just the drying rack, but confidence, teamwork, and reliance on their own abilities. As evening approached, the smoke continued to curl around the meat, turning its color slowly from deep red to dusky brown. The scent filled the clearing, warm and comforting. The cadets stayed near it like guardians around a campfire, proud of what they had created. For the first time since the nutrient crate had failed, the camp felt safe. The food of today was secure. The food of tomorrow was already taking shape above the steady rising smoke. Mark woke the next morning to the smell of smoke that was no longer harsh but warm and mellow, carrying the distinct aroma of drying meat. Dawn light filtered through the twisted branches above, soft and golden, brushing over the camp in long, slanted rays. The cadets stirred slowly, some stretching stiff limbs, others blinking sleep from their eyes as the new day settled around them. Hunger still sat in their stomachs, but it was no longer the sharp, panicked kind that had threatened to overwhelm them when the rations first failed. Now it was a quieter sensation, dulled by the knowledge that food waited on the drying rack. Mark stepped from his lean-to and approached the rack. The meat had darkened further overnight, turning firm at the edges. Thin curls of smoke still rose from the fire pit beneath it. Tali stood nearby, her amber eyes bright with pride as she guarded the rack like a sentinel. She had volunteered to watch it through the night, determined that no stray creature or gust of wind would disrupt the process. You did well, Mark said with a tired smile. Tali's ears perked. It was not hard, she answered. The fire stayed steady. The smell kept curious animals away. Mark inspected the fire and carefully added 2 more thin branches to maintain the smolder. The cadets approached as he worked, forming a loose circle around the rack. Kirik's antennae quivered with anticipation as he stared at the drying strips. Saran slithered forward with a slow, graceful motion, his scales gleaming a muted green in the early light. Varen remained at the edge of the group, his translucent skin glowing faintly in the sun. Mark turned to them. Today we finish the drying process. After that, we will store the meat. But first, each of you should eat something. A collective wave of relief moved through the cadets. The work of the past day had kept them occupied, but hunger had never fully left them. Mark cut several thinner strips, ones that had dried enough to be eaten now, and passed them out. The cadets held their portions with an almost ceremonial reverence, as though afraid to break the moment. Saran took a cautious bite, hesitated, then nodded slowly. Strange texture, he said. But good. Better than I expected. Kirik buzzed his wings in agreement. Savory, he said. Smoky. A little tough. It is supposed to be tough, Mark said. Dried meat lasts longer when it is firm. Chew slowly. Tali ate hers quickly, her short fur bristling with pleasure. It tastes like victory, she declared, earning a few tired laughs from the others. As the cadets ate, Instructor Vale approached. Her boots made no sound on the dusty ground, but her presence drew every eye. She stopped beside the rack, lifting one strip of meat between her fingers to inspect the coloration. Well done, she said. Her voice held no exaggeration, no embellishment, just simple, direct approval. This will keep your group strong enough to finish the trial. Kirik straightened immediately. We did it, he said, pride radiating from his posture. Vale inclined her head slightly. Yes, but the final test is not the construction or the hunting. It is your ability to use what you learned to carry yourselves forward. Survival is not a single effort. It is a sustained practice. The cadets nodded, absorbing her words with newfound seriousness. Mark returned his attention to the drying rack. He began rearranging the strips to ensure even airflow. Saran helped by lifting sections carefully, his long fingers surprisingly gentle. Varen assisted in weaving a few fresh vines to reinforce the structure. The group moved around the rack with a sense of unity that had not existed before. As the morning sun rose higher, the meat cured steadily. The occasional breeze stirred the smoke, sending it drifting through the camp in soft waves. The cadets spent the hours working around the camp, repairing lean-tos, reinforcing the fire pit, and sharpening the practice blades to cut meat more efficiently. The tasks seemed lighter now that their stomachs were no longer empty. Around midday, Mark declared the meat ready. He examined each strip with careful attention, pressing lightly to test firmness. When he nodded, the cadets gathered again, eager to participate. Mark instructed them in storing the dried meat. They laid smooth stones in a shallow pit, lined it with clean leaves from the fruit-bearing shrubs growing beyond the clearing, and stacked the dried strips carefully. Varen sealed the pit with more leaves and weighted them down with stones to keep animals out. When they finished, a palpable sense of accomplishment settled over the group. Food was no longer a fleeting moment. It was a resource, a security, a proof of their ability to survive. Saran looked at Mark with a thoughtful expression. "Without you," he said quietly, "we would not have managed any of this." Mark shook his head. "All of you worked for this. I showed you a method, but you built the traps, tied the vines, kept the fire steady. Survival is a group effort." Kirik stepped closer, his wings humming slightly. "But you showed us how to think," he said, "not just how to act. That matters more." Mark looked around at the cadets, dusty, tired, but standing straighter than before. Something inside him warmed. He had not expected to lead. He had not planned to. But necessity had a way of shaping leadership out of whoever stepped forward first. As the afternoon sunlight softened into amber, Instructor Vale called the entire group to gather. She stood near the center of the clearing, her posture formal and composed. "You have 2 days remaining in the trial," she announced. "But for your group, the greatest obstacle has already been overcome. You did not wait for rescue. You did not rely on malfunctioning machines. You used the world around you and the skills you learned from one another." She looked directly at Mark. "Your initiative preserved the health of this team. But more importantly, you taught them self-reliance. That is the purpose of this training." Mark felt heat rise in his face, but held Vale's gaze steadily. She turned to the rest of the cadets. "You followed him not because he is human, but because he acted when action was needed. Remember that. Leadership arises from those who accept responsibility without waiting to be assigned it." The cadets stood taller, their chests swelling with pride and determination. Vale stepped back. "For the next 2 days, you will maintain the camp, monitor the traps, and ration your dried supplies. Barring emergencies, you will receive no further assistance. Your performance so far suggests you will succeed." With that, she walked away, leaving the group in a silence that felt rich and meaningful. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the camp, Mark and the cadets gathered around the fire pit, no longer to stave off hunger, but to share a moment of hard-earned calm. The smoke curled upward in slow silver ribbons. The dried meat stored safely nearby gave the camp a sense of stability. The cadets spoke softly, exchanging stories from their home worlds, their voices filled with newfound respect for one another. Saran described the hunting traditions of his ancestors, which he had once dismissed as outdated. Kirik confessed that he had always feared the idea of killing any living creature, but now understood the purpose and responsibility behind it. Tali spoke of her childhood among farmers who rarely touched tools themselves, relying on drones and automated harvesters. Each story seemed to connect the group more tightly, weaving them together with threads of shared struggle and shared triumph. Mark listened, contributing only when asked, content to watch the bonds between the cadets strengthen. When night finally settled, the camp glowed with steady firelight. The cadets drifted to their lean-tos with full stomachs and lighter minds. Mark remained by the fire for a while longer, staring into the embers as the stars emerged overhead in slow, glittering waves. He felt tired, but not the bone-deep exhaustion of desperation. Instead, it was the tiredness of accomplishment, of a job done well enough to let him rest without worry. He thought of his grandfather, the old man's soft voice, his steady hands, his stories about how survival was not about fighting the world, but understanding it. Mark felt a quiet gratitude that those lessons had survived in him long enough to matter here. When he finally stood to leave the fire, he looked once more at the drying rack, the sealed pit of food, the secure lean-tos, and the cadets sleeping peacefully. The trial was not over, but the fear that had gripped the group from the moment the rations failed was gone. In its place lay something stronger: competence, unity, and confidence built from their own effort. Mark stepped into the darkness of the lean-to, knowing that whatever challenges remained would be met by a group transformed through necessity and guided by newfound skill. The trial would end in 2 days, but the lessons learned here would follow each cadet long after they left this harsh world. It was not technology that had saved them. It was not luck. It was knowledge, cooperation, and the courage to act. And that, Mark knew, was a kind of survival no machine could ever replicate.